Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's very nice. It's very interesting because Caryn and I have talked a little bit about our process and our interest in the print. And one of my questions to you has been, you told me you were primarily a painter. So what interested you in printmaking?
Yeah, so probably about 7 years ago, I noticed that I was really interested in what was happening on my palette. So as I was manipulating the paint and moving it around, periodically I would sort of stop and pull a print from what was happening on this piece of glass, this large piece of glass. And that happened many times over time, and I realized that there was something about manipulating this material on a surface, and then that action of pulling that paint off of that print really intrigued me. I liked the effects that I got. I liked that sort of after image. So I thought, well, clearly there's something about this process that interests me. And, I think it was maybe around 6 years ago, I decided to start experimenting with just a water-based block printing ink on a piece of plexi. At that time, I also was experimenting with letting go of the brush for a little while in my painting process. So I was using, a squeegee from printmaking, the brayer as a mark-making tool. And I really there was something really fascinating about inking the plate, manipulating the ink, pulling a print, and then seeing what I could do with continuing that process. So from an early point on, instead of creating an image or having some kind of preconceived idea of what I was doing on the plate, I really let the material and the ink drive what was happening on the surface. I particularly loved the kind of ghost print. Like, I love what happens kind of in that second, third iteration. So really, I think the kind of gateway for me was the palette, which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot is happening on that palette. We all know with the palette knife that is similar to the plate. And Joan, I saw a video of yours from Instagram where it looks like you're making paper in this huge vat of water.
In my swimming pool.
And I was like, oh, that looks really fun. So I was curious about it seems a little bit like maybe things start with the paper. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that process.
Well, one thing is that I always, I trained as a printmaker, and I went through all the different processes, but I was never satisfied with sort of being totally like a graphic process, and I also was not that interested in doing editions. I always felt that the print could be more than just an edition print. It could be just a single work of art. So, and I always liked working free form, but people always wanted to frame my work. So the reason I started making my own paper was so that I could do large scale works. And I figured if I made them large enough, no one would frame them, So it's one way to stop people from framing your work. So I started making large sheets of paper, like 5 by 7 feet. I make it up to 8 by 10 feet. And we literally do, it's like a swimming pool and so the work starts from the paper. And then I also paint with paper pulp. And from that, I then create collograph plates I always say I go from 3D elements that I emboss in my plates to start out making the plates. And then I print them. And I use this method called collograph, which I particularly love collograph. It's like there's so much you can do with it, nuances like lithography, which was a love I had, but lithography is a little difficult when you want to start doing paper that's not real flat. So I work primarily with collograph and some relief. And then I laminate them to Duralar, and then I start cutting them, and then I create 3D work. So I start out with the 3D inspiration, I make it flat, and then I make it 3D again.
Nice.
So that's kind of how my brain thinks. But I just like the mark that I always think the mark of a print is a sculptural mark. And I thought it was interesting that you using monotype, that to me that's always been a very painterly mark.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was thinking too I was picturing you on the beach collecting these objects that are the detritus, right, from the ocean. Bringing those back, so those start as the 3D object, right? They're an object. Then the paper, the printmaking process, then it becomes sculptural again. But I was thinking about I guess I've been thinking a lot about materials and process as holding a metaphor in and of themselves. Like there's something about the collection that seems important in your work, like pulling that stuff off of the beach, right? Doing something with it. But I didn't know how, like, if you think that much, if the process feels like it holds a lot of the meaning for you.
Well, it's more that I've been a sailor since I was 16, and I've watched, bodies of water become polluted and then become cleaner. And I became interested in what was happening to the ocean. And I always tell people that I play in the ocean and I work in water, so water seems to be around me all the time. Plus I live on an island. So add all those things together, water to me is incredibly important. And I did a project for a hospital, and I researched about aquatic plants that were being used as medical healing plants. It was a book I saw by an Aztec doctor. And so when I was starting and doing that, then I started reading about how soft-shell crabs, they use the blood to detect dangerous endotoxins in medicine. And then I started thinking, well, okay, now we're polluting the ocean with plastic, so we're finding cures for cancer, possibly in sponges. We're using soft-shell crabs, horseshoe crabs. In Maryland, I go soft-shell crabs.
You messed that up. They're on your mind.
I know, they're on my mind, horseshoe crabs. And I thought, and now we're polluting this incredible body of water that has all these mysteries that we still don't know that much about. And so that becomes the impetus of the plates. It's like, I create these stories about what's happening with, our waters. I mean, it's most of the time I deal with pollution with water. And so then I started collecting plastic on the beach. And, when I was younger, you would collect glass, you barely see glass anymore. Now you find, lots of plastic. That's not exactly something you want to collect. But so that's what I do. And I have bins of it and bins in my studio. And then I work from that.
And I know that you and I both share this interest in repurposing materials. So not only the actual physical materials we work with, but even our sculptural installations can have components that can be kind of like reused, repurposed, reworked, right? Which is really nice, because then it's literally like the work grows, right? It can adjust and it can grow. And so I started becoming fascinated with tracing paper a few years ago, which is not a material that I had really paid that much attention to. I was working on a piece called Stratus, which we might go back and pull it up, where I was doing a bunch of monotypes where I would ink a piece of plexi with marks that were reminiscent of forms we see in nature, rolling hills, trees, these types of things. And I did all of these prints on more of a mixed media paper, a thicker stock paper. And then this was 2020, and I decided I was going to let paper be paper, and I was not going to tame it flat anymore. I just was like, it's 2020, it's crazy. I was like, I'm not forcing this paper to be flat. So I did all of these prints, these black and white monotypes that I then ended up cutting up into remnants and assembling them into a piece that has this sort of gradation that almost feels like a shift in atmosphere. And I have a background in landscape painting, and I've always been passionate about the landscape. And now I become even more sort of focused on changes in our landscape with global warming. And, on the East Coast, we have these intense storms that come through, flooding in my neighborhood. But anyway, so I'm working on this piece. It's actually this one right here that has this gradation and these marks that sort of start to almost evaporate into a light value. And I started thinking about, well, I want to have a layer that sort of implies that atmospheric distance that we see, atmospheric perspective. So I started digging through my materials, and I found a pad of tracing paper. So I printed on it, and I started layering it in, and I was like, oh my God, that's it, because it just created this sort of a hazy layer in this print that I ended up using in the second version of Stratus. And then I was hooked on tracing paper. It's not your common material. And so some of my friends were like, you're using what? And I was like, I need to see this through. I need to see what this material can do. So I think by 2021, I was working with tracing paper as my primary substrate. But what's become interesting about it is it's the fact that when it's wet, it's extremely fragile. and the care that it takes for me to like make the prints and sort of move them and let them dry. And then when they're dry, they're more durable, but they're still, I mean, when we were hanging it, it's like easy to tear. And I brought up that idea of kind of materials and metaphor. For me, I think like the fragility of the material feels really important in the work. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen with this work. Is it going to continue to tear? Will the paper change color? So to me, the actual paper itself feels important to the work.
Well, one thing, we were discussing it earlier, that we were talking, we had a Zoom talk with Brian, and we were talking about our interest in the environment, which you just brought up. And we thought it was rather, we could say maybe humorous or meant to be, but Caryn's piece has to do with the title, Red Sky at Night, Sailor's Delight, Red Sky in Morning, Sailors Take Warning. And did you know that that was first actually documented in Matthew's in the Bible?
It's in the Bible. And shepherds. I think it's shepherds take warning in the Bible, I think.
Yeah. Well, and also, I guess someone wanted a sign from Jesus, and he made a mention. And then, of course, but it is that atmospheric. It's because it's a condition, because storms moves from the west to the east. At night, what happens? In the morning, what happens? But anyways, what was interesting is that my piece of the installation that I have here is, I'm not going to give the whole title because I'd have to read it from my phone, but it's the GPS document coordinates in Narragansett Bay, because in 2020 my boat sank, and I was in a race, and it was in a microburst, which is incredibly rare, but they're happening more and more. And it was like the wind went from 7 to 70 knots, and it was a quarter of a mile wide. And I thought, okay, so now climate change is really affecting me, and in a sense affecting my thoughts about mortality, because luckily nobody out there in the bay, no one died, no one actually even got hurt. But my boat sank, it got hurt, but it was brought back up. But so anyway, so that was kind of a shift from my thoughts about, that I'm doing a lot of things that have to do with plastic. Like this one work in here that you see that's green and red, it's called Algae Bloom. And it's in a sense almost like East meets West. And it's has to do with, algae bloom that we have in Florida, a lot of it, like red tide. And then there was in the Olympics, they had this green tide in China. And so I thought that was interesting that I have this meshing of the piece. So this is a piece that was done for the Water Fire Center in Providence. And then I also talk about repurposing. Whenever I do installations, I constantly add panels to them. And there's another one. This one was an earlier version. So each time it goes up, the piece changes. And I really like that my installations will have a life. Like the piece here, it's a new iteration of an earlier piece that was a single piece. And what I've done is I've added these vine-like shapes. And the next iteration will be different again, which I enjoy. And that's what I enjoyed about your work. Like you can tell that each time it's going to go up differently.
Yeah, I mean, this particular piece, I would say about 2/3 of the materials were prints that I had used in previous installations that I manipulated, added more ink. And I've been trying to commit myself to kind of reusing materials to reduce my consumption, at least some, It's certainly not a perfect practice in that way, but I love the idea of the practice feeding itself, right? We're building from one piece to the next. I think this piece will come down. It might grow. There might be additional components to it. And I like that kind of fluidity and that flux in the work. And I do also have a practice that I consider kind of like a painting practice, where I create works on panel with the same monotypes, but I'm using acrylic and a lot of kind of sanding, and they're very physical pieces on wood panel. And I think of them as though I'm kind of like freezing the materials in one state. So we have these pieces that are fluid, they're changing, and yet there's still a part of me that wants to sometimes have something that kind of like stops the process in that moment. And so I almost, because you and I both deal a lot with the elements of nature, water, we have air, we have all this. And I like the idea of kind of having some pieces that are kind of like a moment in time, still connected to my passion for, I think, picture making, that's still in there. And, but the interest in the sea is something you and I both share, this kind of passion for the water. I've always been driven to the water, but I am intensely seasick. So you cannot get me on a boat. So you're on the vessel, I'm swimming around,
You're swimming around.
But my family has a history in the sea. So my dad has been sailing since he was young. And I'm from a couple generations of stevedores. So they were, my father, his family, his father, my uncle were unloading materials from the shipyards in Baltimore and interacting with the sailors. And so there's kind of this history of this connection with the water. I love actually making works that do reference sailing, even though you do not want me on your boat. I will make it a miserable experience. Because for me, I feel like it kind of connects with those earlier ideas of kind of the vastness of the ocean and us kind of being caught in these forces beyond our control, right? I mean, this is not a new idea. This connects with the history of 19th century Romantic landscape painting. But I love this sort of metaphor of being on the ocean. But you will more likely find me in it.
In it, not on it.
But, do you find that your experiences as a sailor have driven a lot of your work at this point?
Earlier works, and even now, it's like I always like my work to feel like it's moving. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, like the way I create the sculptural moments, it's like if you can think of waves. And one thing I like is that waves constantly change. So when I create there are a lot of installations I do, like the one that I showed, the algae bloom. It all goes up with handmade glass pins that I make. And it's all about my forming it with my own hands. No one else, you were talking about having assistants or whatever. Mm-hmm. I have to do it myself because it's about my physical relationship to those panels.
Yep.
And so that's really important to me.
Yep. I feel like it's interesting being in a print fair, and you and I both, I know this talk was called Off the Wall, which is interesting. It's like we're pulling the prints off the wall, but I think—
Or we're off the wall.
Or we are clearly off. People are like, what is that thing? But I think, I do think that over time, I've become more and more fascinated by paper and its possibilities. I just feel like, we can continue to move forward with these processes, and there's so many options available to us, and the materials that are available now are just phenomenal too.
Well, in this particular piece, which is called Acid Ocean, and if you went to my website, you could probably see it better, is that there are cast pieces in it of paper. So I like that the cast paper can be in it also. And so there's also some of the little like red rubber ducky or little yellow rubber ducky casts, because there was a book that was called Moby Duck about this freighter where these big containers fell off, and all of these little rubber ducks, and I don't know if you've ever read about that, and the squirrels and the turtles or whatever they were. They actually went all around the world, because that's one thing about pollution is
oh my God.
It travels. And so I was fascinated with that pollution, follows the currents around the world. And at one point, people were like selling them, I guess, on eBay, like for hundreds of dollars when they found them. Yeah. And some they found like a year later in Maine, and they'd fallen off somewhere in Asia. And so that's what, I think the other thing I like to engage my audience to think about, my titles usually reference something that I want someone to think about. Mm-hmm. And I want to draw them in with beauty. I mean, that's one of the things with the work. I'm becoming the slideshow person.
She's the impromptu tech person.
Yes, I'm the impromptu tech.
I'm glad you brought up beauty, because jokingly in grad school, we called it the B word. It's like if somebody called your work beautiful, it's like, oh no, but I think when I first saw your work on your website, I realized that you and I both had that connection where the aesthetics do draw people in. And then with more time in the work, you start to notice things that maybe are not quite so beautiful about the work, right? Mm-hmm. Whether they're ripping, falling apart, or whether, you literally have collagraphs of it's trash.
Yeah,
it's trash, much, yeah. It's like beautiful trash. And I didn't know if you want to speak a little bit to that, about this kind of relationship between this sort of bringing people in with the aesthetics, and then that kind of twist that happens when they start to really see the work close up.
I'm sorry, I'm sort of like.
Yeah, you're doing the tech. Like, have you gotten feedback about that from people that like they're drawn in and then they're sort of surprised by what they see in the kind of minute details?
Yeah, well, I know someone once told me that I wanted them to, someone was a sailor. He made some comment that, you know, I wanted to shock them when they came up close to, when they saw what the pieces were actually made out of. One of my favorite ones, I did a project where I was down in Louisiana and I was collecting trash and I was actually embedding it in handmade paper to sort of freeze it in the moment. It was after the one oil spill down there. And and then I was taking photos of this was mounds of trash coming up. I couldn't believe it. And so I ended up making a piece, it's not in this talk, but that the wallpaper was made from trash, but we designed it in such a way that it almost looked like 1950s sort of striped wallpaper. And when people got up close to it, they could see, you know, oil bottles, tampon dispensers, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, that was, to me, was kind of fun. And there's one piece in here that is, let's go further. There it is. Wait a minute. That's the trash with the tampons.
Oh, nice.
In the background.
I didn't know there were tampon images in there.
Well, the tampon dispensers are in there.
Oh, the dispensers, yeah. I was thinking a little bit about scale also, because you and I talked a little bit about how we work in a variety of sizes. And, you know, I mentioned that I still do these works on panel, and I'm kind of doing this with my hands to sort of reference the fact that, you know, when I do work still with painting materials and all that, they do tend to be a smaller size. But I do think that scale is important in a lot of these installation pieces that we make, right? And I think that for me, with some of these works, if they're sort of about kind of being almost engulfed, right, in the paper and in the situation. Is that the word you're going to use?
I was going to use that word too. That
yeah.
I want someone to be in my work, not looking at my work most of the time.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but someone once asked me, did I start small with small pieces and then work up to large pieces? And as Catherine knows, that no, I actually have always worked really big, and the bigger I can work and the bigger the space, the happier. And I eventually figure out ways to work smaller, but I go the opposite direction.
Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know what you, I mean, how do you?
You know, I've noticed lately that I just go back and forth, and I don't know if it's about labor. If I do a big one and then I'm like, I'm going to make a 6x6, and you know, but I also think that because I use similar materials, whether I'm working really large or working small, that I'm working something out in those smaller pieces that will end up in a larger installation and vice versa, right? It's like there's something happening there that might happen in the mark making. So I tend to go back and forth a little bit, I think, in scale. But it is really interesting to see people like physically move differently when they're, like when I saw your work in the galleries in the booth, you have some smaller pieces. And people were getting up really close, right, to those smaller pieces. And then physically watching them respond to your larger piece was interesting, right? There's that tendency to kind of pull back a little bit from it. But I'm kind of fascinated about that kind of back and forth, you know, between the two.
Yeah, that's really important to me. And that's the other reason that I think that I like printmaking, because when I'm creating the plates, you know, I'm really into the detail and the nuances of the change in values that I'm working with. And also the little bits of plastic. Sometimes there's little tiny bits of like really like smaller than my fingernail that I've embossed before I start working like the tones into the plate. And that's part of what I want, is for people to come up closer to it and start seeing these little marks and little pieces and start maybe referencing what they might be. Like some of the pieces will have like a broken comb or a piece of like a lot of bottle caps, like that particular one had the bottle caps in it. So that back and forth is extremely important.
Yeah, I think that earlier you said something to me about like the concept often dictates the scale too, right? It's like, it's about the experience you want people to have. And I know that after a visit to my siblings on the West Coast about a year ago, they had been experiencing intense drought. You know, there was a limited use of water, and this entire basin in the heart of Los Angeles was empty. And then I came home and we were having intense storms. And I remember I was working on an artist statement, and my husband and I were in the basement during a tornado warning, and I was like, and I literally was typing about the sort of like volatility of our environment right now while hunkered down in the basement.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about the piece that I started, Falls to Flames, after this trip, is I wanted to have that duality of the kind of heat and water. Because up to that point, I'd been dealing mostly with being in a climate that's very humid. We have bodies of water, we have a lot of storms, you know, and so in that case, I knew I wanted this sort of, again, engulfing experience, you know. When I saw Joan's piece that has, you said it was, is it algae, the red to green?
The red to green, yeah, it's called algae bloom.
When I first saw her algae bloom piece, and it has this transition of warm to cool, I had it up on my screen, and my husband was like, is that your, like he thought it was my, and I was like, and it's amazing because they're actually driven by, you know, nature, but different elements of nature.
Yeah, the reaction to nature.
Yeah.
Well, actually, talk about reaction. I'm just going to go back since I'm doing somewhat
You're
the
slide
slideshow. I'm the slide lady
She's
today.
dedicated to it.
I'm dedicated to the slide lady. Well, you made that comment. It's like this particular piece is called The Invasion of Hull Cove. And that photograph is actually an actual photograph that has not been photoshopped of of invasive algae that came up on a cove in Jamestown.
There's a photo behind the piece?
It's wallpaper.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I created
That's
wallpaper, a repeat from the photograph of this algae, because I mean, I'm in Jamestown. Things should be brown and blue. They should not be pink. And when I saw this, I was like, I couldn't believe it. And it's because of climate change. Invasive algae is attaching to ships in Asia. It's coming across the ocean, and it's starting to actually, because our water is warming, it's starting to live here. And I have noticed since I took this photo, which was, I don't know how many years ago, it was quite a while ago, that I'm seeing more and more of it. I mean, this was like in a big storm that this came up, but I've been seeing bits and pieces and more of it on the different beaches in Jamestown. And so color is also important to me. This happened to be the actual color, but it also sometimes, I like that idea of like beauty and danger. So there's metal pieces that stick out, that they actually camouflage, very much like in nature where dangerous things are camouflaged.
Interesting. Yeah.
And when you get up close to it, there's times like you might not realize that there's metal until you get close to it. And that's something that's important to me. And I think both of us, we use color to express the concept.
Definitely.
I mean, okay, like here's this one. Here, you can talk about that one. Talk about the blue one.
Oh, the blue one, yeah. So that piece is called Breaking Wave, and it was created in my studio. As I mentioned before, I've always been drawn to the water, but it's like my greatest love and my greatest fear. I don't know, I can't really explain it, but I have a recurring tsunami dream. I think I've had it about 10 times, where I'm standing on a beach with my husband and we see the wave coming, and we just look at each other with kind of a knowing and an acceptance that there's no chance of survival, and we wait for it.
That's very dark.
I know, right? So I've been thinking about waves, and I think also this sort of like acceptance and kind of like humility and powerlessness around nature. So I built a wave out of monotypes that I was creating. And I should say that when I'm inking the plate for my monotypes, I ink with these marks that might imply, again, waves, water formations, earth, and then I will continue to add water and manipulate the ink until the ink is totally gone from the plate. So what you'll see in my prints, which you see in this piece here, is the inking of the plate, the manipulation, and then eventually that ink removal. And there's something about that kind of shift of like, water is the change agent. Water is kind of getting rid of all this pigment on the plate. There's something about that that feels really important to me, you know. And also this idea of like using it all, using all of that ink towards my end product, I think is important to me also. But
why do you use a squeegee?
Oh, I use it for mark make. I just love it. You know, it's funny because when I'm making my prints, I rarely grab a brush. I have like a straight edge blade. I have a wheel. I have a squeegee. I use the palette knife. Oh. And it's so physical. And I think what's interesting about my work, even when you look at like Falls to Flames and even this piece here in areas, it's like there's this presence of the body that at sometimes, although they reference nature, they often feel like cloaked figures, or there's something really about the body in the work too. And I think it's something about the physicality of the making of it, you know?
Well, I think that's something that we share.
Yeah.
Is, and I think that's also going back to the idea of scale, that my interest in scale is because I'm very much into the piece. It's very physical. Like these panels are all like 5 by 7 feet. The plates are that big. I have a press, which you can see there. It'll print like 5 by 9.5 feet.
Oh, I see you
Yeah.
now. You're tiny.
I'm a little tiny.
Oh yeah,
person
that's
over there.
good. That's good for scale reference. Yeah.
And the Earth's above me.
And the Earth is way bigger.
Yeah. But so I like that physicality, but then I also like the intimacy, excuse me, of like hand cutting. And someone asked me like, why don't you use a laser cutter or a crick? I said, there's something about cutting by hand, and there's some books I've read about repetition and trauma. And so I think about that there's that relationship conceptually for me of cutting and doing something that's very intimate and very sort of that I repeat it over and over and over. So, and you repeat also.
Yes, absolutely. And you bring up trauma. I was thinking about how you and I both also use the work as an outlet. I think an emotional outlet also. You know, I know that you've done some work about the loss of your husband.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started working with kind of fire imagery is when my father started cancer treatment with his radiation. So I was literally driving him to basically have this, you know, laser hitting him, you know, like, so there was something about kind of processing his, you know, his throat essentially being kind of inflamed, you know, literally in flames. And so I think whether or not the work is directly about that, I think there is something about processing our lives that comes out in the work also.
Oh yeah, and I also think that there's, I've always said that, and I think that my brain is like a blender, that I'm not a linear thinker. And it's so a lot of times it's hard for me to explain exactly all the different parts and pieces that go into making the work. But all of those things that we experience are going in our head, and then they come out in different ways. And so in that one piece you said that's here that's called Love, Loss, and Serenity, although it has to do with the loss of my husband, there's also these little spiky pieces on it about the loss of sea urchins. We're beginning to lose those. So again, I was making that relationship of personal experience with a global experience. And to me, that's also very important conceptually in my work, when I work.
That kind of global loss. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time. I wonder if it's time for some questions.
I think it's a perfect
I think
time.
it's a perfect time for some questions. So we will open it up for questions, thoughts. Yes.
So I have a question about, you both have talked about the way that you often will rework your pieces or like they'll evolve into other forms. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more about like how you think about like the ephemeral nature of your, if you think about your work as being ephemeral.
That's
or
good.
If you think about it, how you think about it, if you think of it as being like temporal in any way.
Right.
Like just sort of what that means in your work, or if you might use a different way to describe it.
Yeah, so just for the recording, the question was really about kind of ephemerality, if we're considering that, and temporality with the work. And I think for me, with the larger installations, it has felt important for them to be fleeting. Like I have not had a larger piece that has had a life that was longer than a month, let's say. And I feel like that ephemerality really does connect with not only this sort of tenuous state of our environment, you know, but I also feel like, because I'm dealing a lot with elements of nature, you know, water, fire, air, weather conditions, that none of those you can really grasp and hold anyway, right? So it feels really appropriate that the work would have a life for whatever it may be. And by the way, the work changes while it's up. So this recent piece I had at Catalyst Contemporary, if you stopped by a couple times, you'd kind of hear it, because it's tracing paper, you would hear it shift. You would kind of go, Ksh. And I'd look at the curator like, oh, something just moved. And, you know, so I think there's something about that ephemerality that feels really important to me. The temporality is really important in this piece because I was thinking about the idiom, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. The piece that's closest to the window has a red layer under it. And in the morning from about, I don't know, like 9 to 11, there's a lot of red coming through that piece. Then the light shifts and light hits the back of the middle piece, but then that light on that back piece, the red hue kind of shifts and you're getting more of those darker values. Then at 5:59 p.m., thanks to Ann Schaefer, we know, the light breaks from the window and kind of pierces through all the layers of the piece. So there is this light that's breaking through it. And I was thinking about this idea of kind of the red sky in the morning, then this darkness midday, and then a break of light at the end. And I was trying to like describe to someone what I was thinking about this piece, because I was thinking about apprehension and hope, like this sort of fear for our state of our world and this kind of like looming future storm. We don't know what it is, but also I love that that light breaks at the end. I was hoping that the light would break at the end of the day. And last night during our preview party, it was just, it was like, I wish there was a soundtrack for it. It was like, oh, but I don't know for you in terms of the ephemerality, what your thoughts are.
Mine is actually from a sort of a different angle. And that is that, people always think of paper as fragile, or in quote unquote, women as fragile. And I, in a sense, wanted to prove that paper could be made so it wasn't fragile. And so that's sort of more, I'd say, an ephemeral concept within my work. But also with my work, mine are, because I make the paper is, I'm very conscious of everything being archival. It might be my printmaking training, in the background with things. And so everything is archival, but yet the installations that I do that are not fixed pieces, they can constantly change. And that to me is really interesting. That's something that I like to do. And every time, as I said, that piece Algae Bloom, every time I make it, I print more panels for it. So each time I go to put it up somewhere, I have to slightly reconfigure it because there's more pieces in it. So, and I like that there's this, it looks fragile, but it's not.
Interesting. Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh dear.
Sir, in the back.
Yes, you.
Caryn, a quick question about your piece here. And I honestly don't know the question. How much time did you spend conceiving of it, like coming in and looking at the space? I'm always interested in process questions because it just tells about how the creation of it. How long did that process in your head take to develop what we're seeing? Because it is a site-specific piece.
Right, yeah.
And you needed to experience the space a little bit at different times. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, and it was nice that we were in this building last year, so I was familiar with the space somewhat, and a couple visits on site, really looking at the light of the windows was important. I also became really interested in the pipes that I ended up hanging the work from, because they were 10 feet apart, and I started thinking about creating a corridor, like a space for people to really move through and be flanked by the work. And I haven't had a space that's really allowed that experience in that way. So, so there were a couple visits on site, and then actually the piece that has the red background is the element that took the most time in preparing for the exhibition, because the back is our series of monotypes that I created specifically for this piece on repurposed paper. Then there are the layers and layers on top. And then I was sort of taking a break from that piece and creating the long prints that you see in front. So the piece, all in all, was conceived of and created in 6 weeks. But I should say that like a lot of the elements, the surfaces I was working on, I had from previous. So there was definitely a repurposing, but a lot of the thinking happened in the making. Like for me, it's like I start to make it, and then I started thinking, well, this piece has this darker, aggressive marks. I would love it if the piece that was on the other side was a little quieter. There was a little bit of a counterbalance. So as I was making, the ideas were basically influencing each other. But yeah, it was a 6-week process, essentially.
Yes, so when you told me it was 10 by 12 feet, it was a little bit of a conundrum for me because it was it's smaller than most installations I make. Seriously. One of my friends said, well, that's a baby installation for you. And so I had to kind of figure out what I was going to use because there's a piece in here that, might have worked, but it's 25 feet long. And I thought, it's going to be hard to do that there. So I actually created a piece of Tyvek, 10 by 12 feet on my studio floor. And I reconfigured the big major pieces that are actually consisted of 7 sections. And then from there, I thought, okay, what can I do to make this site-specific to this piece? And so I started cutting those long, linear, plant-like forms because I was conceptualizing that, okay, these large, big blocks that have the GPS coordinates are about the boat, my thinking of the boat sinking and sort of being in the bottom of the ocean. And then also my brain started going into, and if it was there longer, plants would start growing around it and on top of it. So I started I created these specifically for here, including those small pieces that are there. And the wall is 13 feet, not 12.
Yeah, they're making it a little
Yes,
bigger.
but you had to know. I got here and I went, it's bigger
And you
than
had
it's
a template,
supposed to
right?
be. Just so you know. So I really hone into this, like what the space is and what I get to do. So, but I was thinking, oh my God, I could never do a piece in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
My hands might
It might have
fall
been a little
off.
crazy, but
Yeah.
And I think like one of the major differences I notice about Joan and our installations is because Joan has the lighting, the artificial lighting that's, obviously illuminates the piece really beautifully. For me, there was also a lot of letting go in this process of like for example, the experience today is totally different from the experience yesterday. The light coming through the piece. Being someone that used to do paintings that were very like controlled and meticulous, this is one big exercise in letting go in a really good way. I did lose a little sleep over it on occasion, like what's it gonna, last night I have to say it was a real gift that in our preview party that light was so phenomenal coming through, it was just so warm. And but I think that ultimately if we're talking about these conditions that we are powerless over to a certain degree, we can do our part in our lives, but I think this sort of planning and letting go is just in the future for me as an artist. It just makes a lot of sense, and I anticipate a bit of discomfort in it, but I feel like it's important.
Well, that's one thing when I was asking you about printmaking, because that is the one thing I love about like print process. I've also worked with glass, I've worked with etching metal, and all of those things you don't have complete control. And I think it's a method by which you do something and then you look at it and then you have to react to what you've done.
Yep.
And that's what I've always been fascinated with. Even I earlier, before I made handmade paper, I was doing printmaking in ceramics. So all my life, I've always been interested in this sort of like, delayed response to what I do.
Right.
And I was thinking that maybe that has something to do with why you're beginning, like you like this process of monotyping on the
Oh yeah,
tissue.
It's definitely a balance of having intention and then a lot of happenstance,
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that I really enjoy, as well. So
wrap it up.
thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Very much appreciate that. That's exactly what I was thinking was going to happen between you two.
Oh, great.
Talking about your work. And just to remind you, if you haven't seen it already, Joan Hall's piece is on the outside of Child's Gallery, which is sort of at the entranceway in the 100 aisle on the outside wall there. And Caryn's is just behind us down in the programming area. Do you strictly work with Child's Gallery, or do you have other galleries that you're dealing with?
I've kind of worked strictly with them, and unless if they want, someone approaches, then they can always, talk with Childs, and because there's, I like being with a gallery that's very close to me.
Yeah.
And someone asked me would I do a show at a university, and I said sure. In fact, I love university galleries because it lets me do more installations.
Yeah.
And installation, like large scale installation, is what I love to do. That's probably my first love as an artist.